So I did a thing today. It's probably been a long time coming. Out of nowhere, I sat down and I turned my first book, Reflections of a Fly Rod, into an ebook for your Kindle. This was, I don't even know when I published this book. This was back in 2017. It took me 3 years to make it an ebook. Everybody asked in the beginning, but I'm too old school and I wanted a paperback. So here we are, 2020, Reflections of a Fly Rod is finally an ebook. Carpart Jerks is next. I just got to figure out how to do it because I published it through a different self-publishing company. So it's probably the same thing. I've just got to go through them and go through all the same stuff that I did with this one. But I thought, so you can get this one, Reflections of a Fly Rod, in paperback, and now you can go on Amazon and get it for your Kindle. So I think my first YouTube episode, I actually read a story out of this book, and I thought tonight that I would read the introduction to it, since you can get reintroduced to it on Kindle now if you already have it in paperback, or if you haven't read it in paperback yet. Now you can buy it for cheap, $14 paperback, $3.69 on Kindle. You can have a digital copy. So I would like to introduce you to Reflections of a Fly Rod by reading the introduction. So, I don't know which I'd consider worse, catching small fish or getting skunked altogether. I guess the worst would be going to work, unless work, of course, ended up becoming writing fishing stories. But writing fishing stories doesn't feel like work, so the old cliche, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, becomes true. Which brings me back to the original question of what I would consider worse, catching small fish or nothing at all. They all make for good stories sooner or later, so I'd have to say that using the word worse doesn't seem to fit anywhere at all in the same sentence for me. Worse relates to something that could be wrong, and when it comes to fishing, short of drowning, nothing could be wrong. And there's that chance to be right even in drowning, while fishing anyways, because of another cliche thing people refer to all the time, dying doing something you love. Writing isn't what I do for a living, but then again, neither is fishing. I'm just your typical everyday Joe, getting through life one day at a time, one job at a time, one fish at a time, or more often, one fishless day at a time, one story at a time. But these days, fly fishing and writing are the only things that make me feel alive. So I guess perhaps they aren't what I do for a living, but just what I do to live. I started fly fishing because I was getting bored with a spinning rod in my hand. And to tell the truth, there was something romantic at the time about the mystery of fly fishing to me. The images of loops in the air and the arch of a slim 9-foot rod of graphite or glass or even bamboo. At the same time, I'd always thought of writing being somewhat of a romantic thing. I was a fabricator for many years, and my shop was filled with quite a few old tools. One of my favorites being an old cast iron drill press from the 1930s that still ran on straps rather than rubber V-belts. A friend had once told me that there were plenty of new tools that could replace my old and weathered machines, but that I was too much of a romantic to switch to new, streamlined, and more efficient equipment. I laughed at him at the time, but now I can see what he meant, and that he did know what he was talking about after all. Telling stories is possibly the oldest tradition the human race has ever had. Even before spoken language, there were always cave drawings of animals, of human figures in pursuit of them, and grunts and nods of approval in the background while bushy eyebrows raised in excitement as the storyteller scratched out the scene, reliving the story and putting it up there for future generations to marvel at. Stories have always been important to us and always will be. However, it's a well-known fact that fishermen have always had the best stories. Why? Because all fishermen are liars, and liars tell the grandest stories, of course. The bulk of the stories in this book were at one time new stories up on my weekly blog on my good friend Jordan's website, jprossflyrods.com. They're still there. One handshake deal between friends, and before I knew it, I had over 50 short fly fishing stories and counting up on his site. People I worked with, some of my wife's friends even, began reading them. And then some people I didn't know. Some of them didn't even fish, which started me thinking. Just like I tell people when I go out the door with a fly rod in my hand that it's not always about the fish. If people who didn't fish read my stories, maybe the stories aren't always about fishing exactly. What finally hit home for me, the thing that pushed me over the proverbial edge to put them and some other new stories into book form, was when my buddy Dale at work told me that he liked my stories because they were just the right length for when he sat on the toilet in the morning. You just can't argue with that tried and proven logic like that. So I began compiling stories from the blog and the various notebooks and scraps of paper, and this is the finished product. I fought the idea of calling myself a writer for quite a while, as if admitting to it or accepting the title would somehow turn it all on end and ruin it. But here I am, writing the introduction to my first book, with 2 other books both approaching the halfway point. Who knows where it all leads? The story is really never over, is it? There's always one more to tell, editing, revisions, or even sequels. Jordan asked me as we walked out on our last brook trout trip of the year where I saw myself in 3 years with this whole writing thing. I thought for a few seconds and then gave him my answer. Fishing. So Dale was mentioned in there. Dale actually got put on the back of Carper Jerks. Dale Correa, blue collar maintenance guy. I wanted real people on the back of my book. He was the one that said they were perfect length for sitting on the toilet in the morning. But the way he described them to somebody stuck, and I put it on the back of my second book. He said they're fishing stories. They're stories about life where fishing happens, and I use that all the time now. I think that's what Reflections of a Fly Rod is. Stories about life where fishing happens. So today, on a whim, spur of the moment, I sat down and I made Reflections of a Fly Rod, an ebook available on Kindle. So, Carper Jerks is next, probably within the next week or so. I'll do the same with that. So you can go on Amazon, you can buy both my books, and now you can buy Reflections of a Fly Rod for your Kindle. I think I'm going to start reading a story out of Reflections of a Fly Rod. Probably not on every episode, but a lot more often on my episodes because they're nice and short. So subscribe to the channel. Even if you're not a reader, you'll get to hear the stories. Share the channel because I want other people to find this, because my ultimate motivation with this channel is to get you to call in sick and go fishing. Subscribe, share, blah blah blah, all that crap. The next episode, I think I'll read a story out of Reflections of a Fly Rod. And probably have another beer. And maybe it's actually nice and cool. It's not so humid and muggy. Maybe sit on my kayak in the garage and read it to you. I don't sit out here. Don't get the impression that I sit out here all day on my kayak. I don't. But this seems like a good place to do the episode sometimes. And let's face it, I paid $2,500 for a kayak. And I said, I'm going to use that thing as much as I can for the money that I spent on it. This counts. I'm using it. All right. Buy my books, read my stories, call in sick, and go fishing. See you next time.